Hello. It is not Jonah Goldberg, but this is The Remnant, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. But I am Chris Stirewalt, so sorry, that's your unfortunate circumstance. But I have brought leaven for this Goldberg-less loaf. I have brought, well, maybe I'll put it to you this way. When I write history, I am doing a poor imitation of this person, because this person has the capacity to write history like a journalist, to write history rooted in the context of its time. This person has written three very important, and I mean that in the complimentary sense of that, three very important books about 20th century American history. She has written other books, but the three that are germane to our discussion today, and you'll know who it is as soon as I list them. The Forgotten Man in 2007, which was a history of the Great Depression with an economist's eye. In 2013, Coolidge, the definitive biography of my favorite president of the 20th century. And in 2019, The Great Society, A New History. Joining us is Amity Shlaes. She is the chairwoman of the Coolidge Foundation. She is the boss over there. You have read her at the Wall Street Journal. You have read her at Forbes. You have read her everywhere. And you are a very welcome guest. Thank you for being with us.
Well, I'm so glad to be with you, Chris.
You know, it's good to most books. Like, I wrote a book about populism because populists were thick on the ground. And a publisher said, hey, why don't you write something about all these populists that are climbing over the gates? And so I did. It's even better if you can write the books before the things happen. And your timing has been pretty impeccable. You wrote The Forgotten Man. The Forgotten Man came out in 2007, a year before the financial panic that led to all of the discussions about policy in the Great Depression and all of those things. You wrote Coolidge before the sort of anti-Coolidge movement took hold in the Republican Party. And you wrote The Great Society before the coronavirus pandemic. And I want people to think about this. We were certainly in a progressive and sort of nationalist, populist vibe in American politics when you wrote that book. But it was the pandemic that really tipped things over into the sort of grandiose, large-scale ideas about what kind of powers the government has to change things and reinvent the future and do all of that. So I'm sure there's some luck involved, but good job, as we would say in West Virginia, you saw the seam in the rock.
Seam in the rock. Well, thank you. Yeah, I think the COVID reaction was as important as the reaction to 9/11. And the reaction to 9/11, let's just start with domestic, was wonderful. By and large, pulled together. Even New York, which is so maligned, showed its best spirit in reacting to 9/11. There it was, ground zero. And, you know, to this day, I'm proud of New York's reaction to that catastrophe. COVID was sort of the other way. You're like, don't go that way, please, guys. Don't go that way, please, guys. And yet the country went that way. And I think I wrote a column somewhere or said somewhere, we always lived in an authoritarian state. We just didn't know it till COVID. that was the creepy feeling. Oh, I always knew this, but I didn't know it until now. And so that was quite interesting. I think a lot of us thought Americans wouldn't wear masks for more than 3 weeks, even though people died just by our nature. We read the country wrong.
And I remember the first time the government of the District of Columbia sent a text to my phone that I had not solicited or signed up for we're tracking a COVID. And I was like, they have my phone number and they can text me and they know who I am. And they did. And it was, you were right, creepy. So let's think about this moment. As we record this, it has been reported, and with lots of reason to believe that it is so, that later this month, the Republican Party will gather at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library in California to have their debate. and that it will focus on Reaganite foreign policy. We'll talk about a Reaganite domestic economic agenda of opening up opportunity and increasing economic freedom. And the frontrunner for the Republican nomination will not be there. He will be in Detroit. And it is said that he might even go join United Auto Workers on the picket line in their still young and mostly symbolic, but with the potential to grow into something much larger, the first ever strike against all big three auto manufacturers. And the reason I asked you to indulge us today is when I hear, and Republicans and Democrats, whether it's Josh Hawley on the right or Vivek Ramaswamy, but then certainly Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, when they talk about the idea of having labor unions in the front seat when it comes to setting American policy, when it comes to how our economy is arranged and arranging our economy, they sound as if it had never been tried before, as if no one had ever thought, well, gee, we should get the unions here at the table and driving policy, which is why everyone who has not done so already should get the Great Society, which is just a great history. So walk us through that arc. Where does that take you?
Well, there are two questions vis-a-vis just labor. The book is about, say, 1960 to 1972. But so I include Richard Nixon in the Great Society and JFK. But vis-a-vis unions, which is our topic today, here, two questions. Can unions have influence in America and be a big part of politics, which feels new to younger people, at least, right? And two, what happens when they do? Those two things. So should I start with can unions, shall we?
Go where you wish.
When you look at, there was an analyst who commented that Sean Fain of the UAW was dramatic and that this was not your grandfather's UAW. And I have a National Review column coming out today or tomorrow that says the problem is it is your grandfather's UAW, and the grandpa was Walter Reuther. It's not even a name we know anymore. It's spelled like Reuther, and it's pronounced Reuther.
From my hometown of Wheeling, West Virginia, and if you live in Detroit, you still take the two main highways that go north out of Detroit. The one that goes towards the suburbs, the one that goes towards the more affluent suburbs, is the Chrysler Management, and the one that goes to the eastern side is the Reuther, which goes towards the Union, the more blue collar suburbs of Detroit.
Oh, the Reuther. So if you're of a certain age, when you were growing up, at night you'd hear, the casualty count from Vietnam. And the next line from Walter Cronkite or someone would be, Walter Reuther said. So it was a refrain in the ear of us children. And then powerful Wilbur Mills of the Ways and Means Committee, names like that. And you heard them every single night. So Reuther was actually a wonderful man in the sense that he was a lovable man. As far as I can tell, he was not corrupt. He was not unnecessarily violent. He was the kind of person you'd be proud to follow, except he was wrong. And his story is the following. He came out of West Virginia. In fact, his father, Valentine, was a socialist, the German kind. Remember, in Germany, there was a failed revolution in 1848. A lot of those Germans came here. And Valentine did not want a Carnegie Library in the town, as Chris was just reminding me, his town in Wheeling, because he didn't want to seem bribed by Andrew Carnegie. So
if you've ever been to Wheeling, West Virginia and wondered why it has such an ugly public library, the answer is Walter Reuther's dad.
Walter Reuther's dad. And he had these three tremendous sons. I had more, but three we know. Walter, Victor, and Roy. And off they went to Detroit in 1927, which is to say, really after a very strong decade of automaker growth. and got jobs in the worst shops. And that was the time of where Frederick Taylor was the other god besides Henry Ford. And efficiency was the goal on the floor, and there weren't many health protections. And in that snapshot of industry, the Reuthers determined they would unionize Detroit. It wasn't unionized. I don't know how fast you want me to go, but eventually Walter, who was a redhead, a very good speaker, by the way, he's all over YouTube if you want to look, did unionize the big three with bloody battles that are famous.
Well, I was going to say, talk a little bit about the battle on the bridge and what that annealing moment was like.
Well, it was annealing because it was on public property. So you're the union. You're trying to unionize a big factory. I think it was River Rouge, right? It was Ford. Yes. So Ford was the last holdout. Ford started his company. He was not a corporate guy. He was not accustomed to compromises. And they were distributing pamphlets, the Reuther team, on unionism, and thugs came and beat them up a good. And they were photographed by photographers they acknowledge and were arranged. They knew that they might get hit. And it was sort of like you go on that square of the sidewalk where nobody can claim they own it, but very close to the factory. So Ford's men had bloodied the faces of honest men, not even on Ford property. And it was a great case. It was a great picture. It went around the world. Ford gave in. One could say perhaps alas. Detroit was unionized. The big three were unionized. And the Reuthers got management of what we now call the UAW. Okay, what are they going to do? In the 50s, as automakers are making enormous profits, remember this industry is much more important than it is today. And you want to ask what unions' effect on the importance of autos is in America over time. They were making money hand over fist. So Reuther in the 50s exacted various concessions from the companies, such as hospitals, healthcare, pensions, healthcare for seniors, all things that seem to us, all right, and at the time, well, it looked like the automakers could afford that.
Yeah, I was
the
going to say.
Automakers could afford anything.
Right. The phenomenon of what was still a relatively new industry, right? The idea of large-scale auto manufacture didn't come in until the 20s. And then after the federal government bought all of the bombers, all of the tanks, all of everything that built out the big three during the Second World War, here was the United States, the world's car manufacturer, right? Germany and Japan were obviously not in the car business, and nor was Korea, nor was China, nor any of the competitors that we have now. And profits were going up so fast and so much that the automakers wanted peace, right? Whatever the price we have to pay to have prevent work stoppages, whatever we need to do to keep the gravy train rolling, we're going to do.
Right. There was a joke, maybe Ford will buy the U.S. government. It was growing faster, right? And that more GM, that made sense. But we were in a bubble at that time. If you can imagine it, the Marshall Plan was written in part in the name of getting Europeans to have money so they could buy things that we made, right? That the export idea, hadn't really penetrated, and Japan was even worse. And, so there's a joke they always say about the 50s. They seemed golden. Democrats want to go back to the 50s so they could work there. Republicans want to go back to the 50s so they could live there. Yeah, and that's really the way it was. But there was an awful... I think the 50s had their dark side, but Reuther was the star of that period, and he got unprecedented concessions from the automakers. Then I want to mention one other thing, and this is on YouTube. There's an interesting little aberration or side path he takes where he moots in the 1958 negotiations. Imagine he has at least, maybe 1 million workers at this point. That means he can carry a state. Important politically, he moots the idea in 58 of profit sharing. from the automakers. And whoa, well, the automakers like, oh no, that sounds like socialism to us. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Particularly not a plan. That sounds like Germany, and we know why we have workers in the boardroom in Germany. It's to prevent the communists from coming in, but we don't do that here. You know, the German work model inspired Reuther much, and the German work model does. I think the new nationalists or new conservatives will pick up the German work model because workers were in the boardroom, labor in the boardroom, and they did have immense training programs, apprenticeships. Anyway, that's not a good idea. And in an interview, Mike Wallace, puffing all the while on a Parliament cigarette, Parliament was his sponsor, kind of berates. And Walter Reuther, you end up sympathizing with Walter Reuther because Walter Reuther did not smoke. He was sort of a Puritan German union guy, like his father. He lived what he said. Braves this and explains all about the profit sharing idea. And, old Mike Wallace mocks Walter Reuther, and you end up siding with Reuther as you watch it. Wait a minute, he has an idea. What's so wrong with this? Does it have to be socialism? Or profit sharing is a flawed concept, but it moves very quickly to stock sharing, which was also a big idea in the 50s, share ownership by employees. Well, what if today's debate were how many shares of Ford and GM do the workers on strike get? I think that's fine. It used to be whole pensions were made of company stock because it aligns the interest of the worker with the employer. And what I argue in Great Society is this whole class war thing was visited upon us by Reuther, was overly influenced by Europe and by progressives in the 60s. America is not naturally a class country. We're not like Europe. So anyway,
we recently celebrated the anniversary of the monumental moments in America's civil rights movement. And here in Washington, if you go to the Lincoln Memorial and go to where Martin Luther King stood, you will not think, I bet there was a labor boss here. I bet a union boss was present at the Lincoln Memorial for the I Have a Dream speech and this monumental scene. But he was there.
He was there. And thank you for this segue to the 60s. So once Walter, our friend, and he's really worth having a look at, moved to the 60s, he was pretty much done with socializing or social democratizing union land. And now he was on to socializing or making America social democratic. And
but tell us about the political power that allowed him to do that.
Even I think it would be Ted Kennedy, interviewed much later, said that's power. Well, let's start with the 1960 election. The Reuthers like the Kennedys like the Reuthers. Two bands of brothers, two clans. Two bands, two clans. You look, you see in the mirror, brothers in brother strength. They didn't like, Jimmy Hoffa, the Kennedys, right? But so these were the good unions, and they teamed up. And Ted Kennedy said, man, that was political power, because when Walter said vote this way, in the days before political giving of unions was constrained and the amount that could be extracted from a worker's paycheck for political giving was likewise constrained. We've had some recent court decisions on that. Walter just took the money and went within, ran for the Kennedys, and he had workers in the UAW campaign for the Kennedys. And they, it's a huge dispute. Did Kennedy really win, or did Richard Nixon? What is undisputed is that the unions generally brought hundreds and hundreds of thousands, probably millions of votes to Kennedy in key states like Michigan and Illinois. So they knew it, and it was acknowledged. There's a really good movie, Brothers on the Line by Sasha Reuther, one of the family members, where the Kennedys just say, yeah, that's true. So he kind of had more than an in with the Kennedys. And what I never understood till I researched this is, what did he want to do? Number one, civil rights. That's a long way from getting, a better lunch at the union or a better paycheck in Detroit or Flint. He wanted to advance civil rights in America. And Kennedy egged him on that. You can see it in speeches. Reuther wanted that. And he was right there for Martin Luther King. And what I didn't know till I wrote this, how right there was he? When Martin Luther King was in the Birmingham jail, Kennedy didn't have the money, and it wasn't right for the federal government to send $160,000 down. So they called Walter Reuther, and he took $160,000 down. His men did, with belts to carry cash that bulged, and bailed MLK out. And it's reported, in fact, in a book by Ten Eyck, which is a newer one, and I think also in my book somewhere, Reuther was genuinely curious. He said, like, hey, why did you call me to bail out MLK? And Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, said you were the only one we could think of. When
I read that, and I reread your book this year because of it was so timely and it lines up so well, and also because I hate the brutalist mid-century architecture.
I hate it too. I think that's really key here.
For people who visit our nation's capital and you say, why do we have these hideously ugly buildings that look like alien spaceships that have landed near the mall? Why is the Department of Labor, the Department of Health and Human Services, why is HUD, why are these buildings so ugly? And why did Washington, D.C. have such a disordered economic life and urban plan? You will find it in Amity's book. You will read it there, and it's awesome. But I want...
Let's just talk about Reuther's damage, though.
Yeah. So what I want... I thought the parallel that I saw, and this is probably goofy, but the Kennedys reaching out to Reuther reminded me of Teddy Roosevelt reaching out to, why am I drawing a blank? J.P. Morgan during a financial crisis, right? You go to the most powerful people on your side. Who's the most powerful? I'm in a jam politically. Who is the most powerful, wealthy person on my side? And for the Kennedys, the answer was Reuther. And they knew that he would be likely to do it because, as you say, he had already moved beyond the sort of pedestrian concerns of getting better contracts with the automakers and had a vision for a really, and as you say, a sweet man, a well-intentioned man, but for really wholesale systemic change in the United States.
Right. But he took the snapshots. He saw bitter snapshots from our past and said, this is America unless we become a social democracy. Very inspired by the Europeans. He had his own a mediocre Corbusian architect, Oscar Stonerov, who has a tragic role in the story. But anyway, there were other parts, of course, beyond civil rights to Reuther's actions. One was he wanted to rebuild the cities and do it in a compromise with the automakers, roads for cars. And the city's countryside classroom was what LBJ saw it. Well, the city's part, Model Cities, was designed by Reuther at his kitchen table. In fact, when Johnson announced this mega program, the program that shaped the 60s and we live in today, we live in Lyndon Johnson's America, it's been said. Where did he go to do it? Michigan. He understood it was to Reuther he placed one of his first calls when Kennedy dies. And you can hear that call. I need you. I need you more than I ever need you in my life. But don't get distracted by Johnson. The power center was also Reuther. So Reuther was going in the wrong direction. By the way, he also set MLK in the wrong direction to get him into rent strikes. You know, what MLK could have been doing was helping African Americans buy homes. That might have been better. That's what the 60s taught us. Renting is not a good deal for many people. No, but Reuther liked rent as well because European model, Europeans think renting is fine. And he sent people in directions. The second point, which was a total shocker to me, was when I was growing up, you heard about the Port Huron statement and the youth at Port Huron Free spirits went and spoke truth to power, independent souls to big bad parents, right? The Port Huron Statement. That was the sort of manifesto and declaration of independence of the 60s youth, was this meeting at Port Huron. It's even mentioned in movies.
I was going to say it lives on forever because it is mentioned in the Big Lebowski, because Big Lebowski says, I was one of the original authors of the Port Huron Statement, not that watered down version that they came up with later.
Very good. Yeah, they had a million versions. I had a lot of trouble getting what I could live with for the book as a somewhat authoritative version. But anyway, this little meeting was super cute. It was you could just imagine it was at one of those dumpy campgrounds, maybe made in the New Deal period along the big lake. And a bunch of people came and they wrote a manifesto. One was Tom Hayden, who later married Jane Fonda, was also, I think, a lawmaker. Another was Michael Harrington, who was sort of, I don't know, J.D. Vance of the day.
Oh, good. Nice.
No, I have to live up to your analogy with J.P. Morgan. I'm still thinking that through. I think it's great, Chris. I didn't think of that. That is so great. Anyway, these names we know went. Michael Harrington, How the Other Half Lives, sort of like Jacob Riis. And poverty in America. And what I discovered in researching this, which I discovered from union people, by the way, it wasn't a dark secret. They said it was this meeting was funded by Walter. In fact, one of the young ladies there, Sharon Jeffrey, maybe even still an undergraduate, maybe just out of college. Well, her mother was Millie Jeffrey, who was Walter Reuther's right arm. Millie did everything, and Victor Reuther ran the education department. They arranged the venue, which they had access to because it had some union aspect to it, this property at Port Huron. And they funded the student movement that came out of it, which was called Students for a Democratic Society, by which Walter envisioned, I don't know, you go into cities and help poor people navigate and fight back against their bad landlords. Something almost out of Bertolt Brecht.
Take us on a sidling here, just to talk about the war, the Vietnam War, and where unions and Reuther were on the war, and because, of course, one of the great constructs in your book, you start each chapter with a tabulation of guns and butter, right? Because that was the Lyndon Johnson famously said that you can have guns and butter, which is to say we can engage in a massive domestic spending undertaking to reinvent cities, to reinvent the way that people live. We can do it all, right? We can lay all this money out and successfully prosecute the war in Vietnam. We can do both. And at the beginning of each chapter, you give us a useful tally about what the cost of the war was and what the cost of domestic spending was. So talk about the interplay between the Great Society, unionism, and the domestic agenda and what was happening in Vietnam.
Well, the message was the war cost so much. And even today, historians will say the war cost so much, so they had to interrupt the Great Society. But Great Society spending outpaced war spending. It was already a big burden by 71, 72. I have a chart in the back of the book where they cross. And I think that's not a sufficient explanation, that the war cost too much. We knew we were going to get out of the war, and that was quite clear from around 1968. The second point is, in terms of the politics in Reuther had to back the administration on foreign policy if he was going to get all he wanted domestically, if he was going to get support through the Great Society for his social democratic dream. So he wasn't about to fight with Johnson about the war, and he probably, a lot of his membership agreed with Johnson on the war. Well, we got to fight, and the younger generation took issue with that and assailed him. I mean, and he did not expect this. There's a wonderful Thanksgiving dinner. They had Civil War Thanksgivings as we do today over President Trump. They had Civil War Thanksgivings, that is family civil wars. over the Turkey, over Vietnam. He was assailed at a Passover, I believe, over the Union's failure to criticize the Vietnam effort by the Youngers. And he's like, wait a minute, guys, I have the world on my shoulders with our union. We're doing so much for African Americans, for workers, for America. Please don't even, that's ridiculous that you even bring that up. He was very offended. And it did split the union eventually.
So Tom Hayden or somebody would say that even if it wasn't the economics of guns and butter, the political damage that Lyndon Johnson did to himself by prosecuting what the SDS and others said was an immoral war, was the crimes being perpetrated by the Yankee imperialists around the globe, undercut Johnson's political standing. And if only, so there's a lot of if onlyism in our politics today. And I noted this with another thing that made me think of you and your terrific book was the RFK Jr. moment that happened earlier this year, where it offers America an alternate timeline. And in this version, well, if only Kennedy had not been assassinated, if only Johnson hadn't escalated the Vietnam War, if only these things had not happened, then we would have moved into the sunny uplands that Walter Reuther and these folks had wanted. And their story of the dark turn, whether they blame the CIA for killing JFK or whether they blame Lyndon Johnson, or I guess they probably blame the CIA there somehow. Also, that because of what happened with the war against communism in the 1960s, that it derailed what would have been an otherwise successful effort to make the United States a social democratic utopia.
Well, that's exactly right. If onlys are darn convenient.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I think, if you go back and look at what was going on, the war mattered less than you think. It mattered very much to some people. Let's just say that. Even though there were so many deaths, particularly the rapid escalation when Johnson, that was shocking for sure. But I think the social democratic dream was rescued by tragedies such as assassinations in the Vietnam War. It gave it the status of socialism, which is, it hasn't been tried yet, that argument, right? It preserved for it that status. And I do have a chapter on Hayden in the book, and I write, and I think you can pick it up from him. That's the beauty of socialism. It's never done, so it can never be judged, right? It's never done. It's never right. But I do want to mention one thing. There's two things about Reuther, and you know what? You're wondering why we're talking about him. This is the replay we're going to have now if we're not careful. One is he went to the Chicago Convention, Democratic National Convention, infamous now, and his goal was to get Humphrey nominated. And imagine his how disconcerted he was, or his nausea when he realized he could look out the window of a hotel and see his own child, Tom Hayden, someone he had funded or someone he knew had funded, wrecking the convention with loud protests that were going to, and did, throw the election to Richard Nixon. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tom. So, thank you. So Reuther actually died. He crashed in a plane going to a little mini utopia he had built with that architect, Oscar Stoneroff. And it couldn't have been more ironic and sad. He flew to his dream one night in one of those tippy Learjets, the early ones, and they crashed with his wife, May. But I did think that was symbolic of the Union endeavor, which is why one wouldn't want to repeat it, and why it's of concern that Sean Fain is wandering around rambling about, I don't know what, the billionaire economy.
So 1968 election is the hinge point in your book, and it's a hinge point in American history. And I should also say one of the delightful things that you do in the book is while you're talking about this, right, the bloody knuckles, the rough stuff of democratic politics, of union stuff, you tell us the parallel story of what's going on in California and Fairchild Semiconductor and an innovation economy that is happening totally unrelated. It exists. And then one of the things I love about California, it is a blessing and a curse for California. They consume American political news generally like Europeans do, which is some of it kind of filters through sometimes. And they're like, oh, I guess that's going on. I don't know. But California is a realm unto itself. And in that realm, the world was being reinvented and remade entirely by people who were absolutely disconnected from the labor strife that was born there at the River Rouge plant, that was born there in the teens and the 20s. And it's a wonderful device. It's really, really good. But in 1968, after the Democrats eat themselves, right? And after all the tumult of the Democratic nominating contest, in which Hubert Humphrey, Walter Reuther, Lyndon Johnson through back channels, and party bosses did succeed in cramming down the viewed skeptically by the progressives and more than skeptically by the anti-war left, they did succeed in getting friend of labor Hubert H. Humphrey the Democratic nomination. He did prevail. And because of, and I don't want to put too many trains on the track at the same time, but in part because of the success of the project of Reuther and the progressives on civil rights, a split Democratic Party, the Democrats lose the South and Republicans gain it. And Richard Nixon, defeated in 1960 with the help of Walter Reuther, ascends to the presidency in 1968. So the Republicans take over and they roll back all of the progressivism. They fight back against unions. They put Coolidgean restraint back into government, favor limited government, and the economy prospers and the people are free. Do I have that right?
No, you don't have that right. You're teasing me. You're teasing me. I was like, oh my God. One of the happy, like, is Amity awake? One of the happy accidents of history, we have a thing now called right to work, where a state can opt out. We had that then because of a law called Taft-Hartley, which is an old law just after the war, which said states can opt out of heavy unionization, to put it simply. I don't think lawmakers realized the power of that opt-out. And then we thereby had a natural experiment all the way to this day. Oh, looky here. What happened in right-to-work states? What happened in non-right-to-work states? Well, that was almost undone. Johnson, of course, had it on the agenda to end right to work. So all America would be locked into one union land, but he never got around to it.
Well, and I want to just,
that would be the war.
I hate to keep distracting you.
Yeah, but okay, but that's a positive.
The story of Everett Dirksen, just tell us very briefly the story of Everett Dirksen, the Republican from Illinois who backed Lyndon Johnson on civil rights. He gave Lyndon Johnson what he wanted on civil rights, and then Lyndon Johnson comes back to Everett Dirksen and says, "Okay, now I need you on right to work.
Now I need you on right to work.
Now I need you to break the companies and create labor land that we want." And Everett Dirksen said, "No."
Everett Dirksen should be around to run today. He's just the kind of no-brand person people like. And he said no, it just rubbed him the wrong way, to force people to go into unions to work for a company. They were shocked. Johnson was tired. He was looking at Cronkite, reading the death count, and it never got through. What's interesting is that Nixon is also in this book. Nixon, for his own reasons, perpetuated the Great Society and in some ways expanded it. And I want to give credit here to John Cogan of Stanford and Hoover, who wrote a book on entitlements where the data are beautiful. And Danny Heil, who worked on that too. I know, because when I did my data, I checked with them. Is this really true? Data are an important part of a story. Is this what you see? And a lot of other people, to be sure I was happy with my data. They just, by the numbers in many places, Nixon expanded the state faster. Why? Well, Democrats had a lot of power in those days, Congress, right? And Nixon even named a Democrat Treasury Secretary, John Connolly, a kind of, let's just say this, he was so big a Texan that he intimidated even the biggest Texan we know, LBJ. I don't know about John Connolly. And so Nixon comes in, and what a pity it is that Nixon, the campaigner, talk about if only had been Nixon the president. He wasn't. And
the next hinge in your book takes place at Camp David, and it takes place as Richard Nixon. So we had another through line in your book is about monetary policy, which again, very applicable today. And getting the gold standard is killing the United States economy, and we're struggling with inflation. And what are we going to do? Well, we've got to get off the gold standard.
We've got to get off it in a way we're not telling people.
Right, exactly. Because if we tell them, it'll create a crisis and a panic, and people will freak out. But the Europeans are killing us on the exchange, and this is a huge problem. So Richard Milhouse Nixon.
Well, under a gold standard, another country at that time could pull gold out. They did. They were. And we were getting close to what we considered and law made the absolute reserve, the absolute ratio of dollars to gold we had. So what did they do? They changed that rule, one, and they removed from the wall. There was a weekly report in the journal, and it just disappeared. It was just ... where a data point had been, because it was an ugly data point. We have too little gold relative to dollars. So it went away. And the final blow to the gold standard was delivered, I would say, by Nixon at Camp David. The Camp David story is a great story.
It's amazing. It's one I did not know. It is one that I don't think has been covered enough. But basically, and I want you to tell it, but for the context of it, you have a situation where, as you say, Nixon had campaigned one way, gets into office. He, too, is paying the political price on Vietnam, but he is paying this terrible political price on inflation and the problems in the economy and all this stuff. So he becomes open to the idea of a planned economy, or more open to the idea of a planned economy, and gathers his Solons together at Camp David. And I think my favorite detail in the story is, I think they got windbreakers. Did they get windbreakers?
We got windbreakers, and some of them got a tumbler.
So tell us the story of the Camp David meeting.
Well, Shakespeare was referenced at that meeting, and it was Shakespearean. You take the best economists in the world, including young George Shultz, for example, young Paul Volcker, for example, who later became the anti-inflation St. George at the Fed, and so on. And I think Pete Peterson was there too. That's the name. We think of Pete Peterson in association with budget balancing, and they all later said mea culpa in their way and wrote apologies pro vita sua, for their at this. But Nixon had world-class economists, which made it harder. So he said, "Okay, I'm going to close the gold window," which means I'm going to close the window to foreign governments that want to pull their gold out. And I'm going to do a lot of other things, mainly with an end to the election. So this was 71 August. The election was 72 November, just around the time that you want to not have a good economy after that date, right, in the buildup. And Nixon knew that well, because he had been told by a Nixon whisperer, Arthur Burns, back in 60, that he lost the election because the economy wasn't doing well, and the incumbents were Republicans in 60, right? So he was darned if he was going to have a bad economy in the run up to his reelection. And he decided he would do all sorts of things, which are kind of like an EMT kit. Think of, let's see, someone is overdosing on oxy, right? You have this shot and that shot, and you have adrenaline, everything in the economic medical kit of 1971 he was going to do, regardless of whether the medicines matched each other. He didn't look at the side effects, to stick to the medical metaphor. He just said, I'm going to shoot the economy up so it feels real good until November, a year hence. But he had to get The Economist as cover. So there were, I don't know, so many components in the econ plan. One was price controls, which are un-American, and The Economist knew it. Another was penalties for imports. Well, if you have price controls, and another was closing the gold window. And as some of them pointed out, well, if you close the gold window, you don't need the penalties for the imports, et cetera. But he just loaded his whole pharmacopoeia was applied. But he had to get The Economist to agree, a difficult achievement given the quality of the economists around him, George Shultz of the University of Chicago. But the sheer joy of being with Nixon at Camp David, that euphoria of political power. They had their own medicine, these economists, not economic nostrums, but just the proximity to power, the love of Nixon, the screen doors in the little cabins in Camp David, just thrilled them, particularly somebody who knew better, Arthur Burns, who was the Fed chairman. And that would be the hardest to convince, because Arthur was a self-important and excellent macroeconomist, one of the highest regarded in his trade. And he had a vanity that he was concerned about. He didn't want his fellow economists to say he had caved to Nixon.
And you in Shakespearean manner track the seduction of Arthur Burns.
No other word will do. It's sort of like, I'm sorry, I'm going to say this, but the Death of Stalin movie.
Yes.
I almost saw Steve Buscemi acting one of these characters. You can see them shifting, and they came back all happy and announced a very un-American plan, worse even than what we announced when COVID happened. And stock market thought it was great. Stock market was happy the president was doing something. Stock market likes action over inaction, but it laid the stage for the stagflation of the 70s. I kind of was a teenager in the 70s. It was a junk decade. Talk about coulda, woulda, shoulda. Larry Kudlow has said, look, all these inventions that I cover in my book, they were there in the 60s, but they were stuck on the shelf in the 70s. Why? Because of our perverse policy coming out of that Camp David meeting. That's so, it's so interesting. So we lost a decade. We squandered a decade. We didn't have to.
The story of your Coolidge book and your important work, and you have succeeded in rightfully burnishing the reputation of Calvin Coolidge and rescuing him from being a punchline in American history. That the courage to not act and intervene when you are surrounded by sycophants, are surrounded by people that tell you how powerful and important you are, and whose own status derives from you doing stuff. And in the Coolidge book, you talk about Hoover a lot, who was the forerunner of the sort of micromanaging, technocratic, we can do it all. There is an answer. We just have to, I hate the phrase, the levers of government. We have to know how to operate the levers here to create we have to create these outcomes, and we can do these things and all of that stuff. And, if Burns was seduced, so was Nixon, right? So too was Nixon seduced by power and by the possibility of the things that you could do. And Nixon, I see Nixon in your story as a person who probably knows better and starts out skeptical. But the political exigency of the moment opened his Overton window, right? Like, well, we got to do something. We're going to have to do something. What is it going to be? And then McNamara level groupthink sets in. Look at how smart these people are. Look at George Shultz. Look at Burns. I've got the best, the smartest, the best people here, and we've all gathered, and we're going to save the world. It's very hard to give that up. it's very hard to let that dream and that moment die. And it's Shakespearean is the only word for it.
So think of Arthur as playing Cassandra.
Yes.
I always wanted to, but we all know people who could play that role. And I wonder who would be, who Steve Buscemi would play. Who's the Khrushchev here? And I had a very nice correspondence with George Shultz. George Shultz is a fine man. And I had a very nice correspondence with him the first time I wrote about this. He said, you haven't got me quite right. It wasn't me who wrote that. And he was probably right. It wasn't George who wrote that. And maybe I was not sufficiently appreciative of his role there. But the main thing is they all went along. And being there does matter. I actually was thinking of Coolidge's line, because I wrote this book after Coolidge, where Coolidge did say, you got to get out of the presidency because you're increasingly, as you said just now, Chris, surrounded by yes men and panderers. And Coolidge actually said that in his autobiography, which the Coolidge Foundation published with ISI. I recommend it. It has French flaps. It's a nice book. But everything you need to know, Coolidge said. That's one of the I think his what's the word? His vision of what was wrong was probably Theodore Roosevelt, but he was too polite to say it. And I'm working now on Theodore Roosevelt. So, tell me what to do.
There's the lead. I'm so excited because there's nothing like the misty hagiographic lust for the non-existent story, the false story of Theodore Roosevelt that when we think about things from history that distort our understanding of the present, it is who Theodore Roosevelt was and what he did and what worked and what didn't work. And I have an obsession with the election of 1912. I have an unhealthy degree of obsession. And William Howard Taft has become a hero of mine because of his courage, because of the political courage that he exhibited when his old boss came back to eat his liver. Yeah,
he's a very familiar type. William Howard Taft. What Mark Twain said about 1908, which is the election before, and Twain is in my book. There's no bitterer criticizer of TR than Twain, interestingly. Twain said, in 1908, I'm going to vote for the monarchy, which is to say, I'll vote for Taft. And he didn't dislike Taft. I think he said the main thing about him is he's not Roosevelt. And he's not Roosevelt. And there's a couple good books about Taft. I think Rosen wrote one.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there are a couple good books about Taft. He's very Bush-like, he reminds me of the Bushes. He's got a lot of that, I hesitate today, but Yale culture.
Yale culture, family pedigree.
Yale culture in a good way, I should say.
Yes.
As a Yale.
I love that in the lobby of the United States Chamber of Commerce hangs a portrait of William Howard Taft, and he looks the part. When you see the portrait in the place, it all lines up.
Yeah, and if I had to work for a TR, I would have eaten a lot of cookies at night too. He really ballooned.
Dare I ask, when we can expect to see this Roosevelt book?
I'm hoping 18 months. I wish it were sooner. That's a little ambitious. No, maybe 2 years. That's a little ambitious. I don't want it to take so long. It's really, all books are life and times, right? So the Coolidge book started out as a book about the 20s, actually. And then I shifted to Calvin because he told the story, carried the story so well. And I'm on the same now because the robber baron vision, what was TR fighting against? He was fighting against malefactors of wealth. He was the octopus hunter and so on. And someone said, I think it was Elihu, you realize you're dealing with a 5-year-old when you're dealing with TR, right? Who said that? Someone right.
The Trump TR comparison is real. There's stuff in there. There's lots of cool echoes.
But you know what? Even if President Trump is not in the picture, what you put your finger on is there is an appetite for populism in America. And that's what opens us to candidates who might not be coherent. Because my definition of populism is it's a collection of impulses from real wrongs, but the impulses aren't a program.
Yes, that's right.
They're not coherent.
So. Okay, we've come to the end, and I am sad and sorry because I could talk to you literally. I could talk to you all day. You are a national treasure. Your histories have been essential in helping Americans better understand the world we inherited in the 21st century and why they're practical, they're useful, they're important. I love them. And thank you so much for being with us today. I hope everybody who hasn't done it reads The Great Society. It is you will say 100 times as you read it,
That's what I said. That's why I wanted to mention Jonah's book, and I forgot. Jonah, I think I need to show appreciation for Jonah, and particularly now that I'm working on one of the areas he covered. So I'll write him. If you send me an email, I'll send him a note saying I'm studying what you wrote.
If Jonah was here, he would resist praise because that is his way. But he is not here, and we are in command of his podcast today. So I will allow it, I will second it, and I will encourage it.
Jonah took issue with Forgotten Man because he thought it was a foreshortened version of history. Because there I started with 1927 or 28, and it had all the ammo was already out. Right, waiting to fire was Jonah's point. And here Amity pretends history started in 27. And to some extent, he was right. I just had to start the book somewhere. And you can't, if you say it all began with the Sherman Act, that's an awkward time frame for a book. Books have to have velocity, you know. But Jonah was right, and I want to tell him that.
We just need to say thank you, and we need to say how grateful we are to you and what an important resource that you are for scholarship and clear thinking in the United States of America.
Thank you. Thank you, The Remnant.
Heck yeah. Okay, listeners, Jonah will come back. He will get out of his van one day. He will return to civilization. But until then, we love you, and we thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.